Imagine going onto YouTube and seeing a video featuring you. The problem, however, is it's not you. And shockingly, it's impossible to tell that the video has been faked. That's what's possible now with deepfake technology, which no longer requires the most high-end technology. What might be a fun tool to prank your friends might actually become one of the biggest ethical dilemmas of the 21st century.
Welcome to Signs of the Times Radio.
Well, it's great to be here again for another episode of Signs of the Times Radio. With me today, I have a quality writer that joins us on Signs of the Times in the magazine fairly often, and that is Nathan Tasker. How are you, Nathan?
It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon.
Where are you joining us from, Nathan?
Currently just north of Brisbane, Queensland, Australia, a little town called Maryborough, if I can get the local pronunciation correct there.
How long have you been living there for?
We've been here about 7 months so far and having a blast. It's a wonderful area.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, Queensland is a beautiful place. Now, Nathan, my sort of interest is in film and television, in moving media, and I used to do a lot of photography. I do more videography now, and it's crazy that amount of work that can be done to a photograph. Like, I don't know about your level of interest in photography, but would you say that's a correct statement, that the opportunities that you would have had with film photography back in the day, with digital, it brings a whole new set of tools with it?
Yeah, you're probably ahead of me. When I was in high school, though, I did have a great interest in film and video. We used to do editing with two VHS tape decks, going backwards and forwards and trying to, mix things together. And we had some pretty fancy software back in the day, Opal Vision 3000 and so forth, to try and actually bring some fairly small special effects like, titles and text to a screen. You had some very basic monochrome kind of overlays we could put on. But yeah, the last 10 years, it's been, 20 years, I guess now, it's blown us away, hasn't it? With all of the realistic stuff that can be done at the layperson's level. Yeah,
it's really interesting because I know Hollywood in particular really started investing into computer-generated imagery in the 90s. And I think it seems like, this is probably something we'll come back to later on, but Star Wars, the film series, seems to have pushed the boundaries a lot with the use of computer-generated imagery. So, for example, Star Wars Episode 1 was the first ever fully computer-generated character in Jar Jar Binks. Now, it's funny, when you watch back on those movies, you kind of see that it's not that, great. It's obviously fake. Probably the question is, because I was only a kid at the time, did it feel that way at the time, or was it like this, whoa, it's so realistic kind of thing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I wonder what our listeners would think about that. I guess for me, when I was a starry-eyed kid in the early to mid-'80s, and I guess when I saw these things, I was starstruck. I guess I had rose-tinted lenses on, and I thought, that is so realistic. Obviously, it probably wasn't as realistic as our expectations these days, but it was an impressive start. And I think when I was a kid, I was expecting great things to come in the near future, and we haven't been disappointed.
The interesting thing is that these things have really taken off, and Hollywood movies are generally saturated with computer-generated imagery. For example, one of the most pivotal moments that's going to sort of tie into what we're talking about today, which is deepfakes, is in, I think it was 2016, my mates and I, we go to see the new Star Wars movie Rogue One, right? So we go there, and it turns out one of the actors who was in the movies in the 70s, Peter Cushing, who had, by the way, he'd passed away quite a few years ago. He is in the movie because they got an actor in there, and using computer-generated imagery, they managed to put his face onto the actor's face, and it was like the actor who'd already passed away is back there again.
Wow.
And that was crazy because it generated a lot of there was a lot of ethical issues that were brought up because of it. This is a deceased person who you're using their likeness again. He didn't exactly give consent for you to use his likeness. Other people were like, oh, this is a great way to sort of honor his memory or tribute. But at the same time, he still looked computer generated in that movie. It's not people weren't fooled that he was alive again. But that's all cool and well, but it's a movie. Now, what we want to talk about is deepfakes, which is when something is taken off the screen and is applied to a real-life context. Can you give us a bit of an idea, what is a deepfake?
Yeah, I guess this is a fairly new term, and maybe we're all learning about it together, but only about as recently as 2018, I think this term was coined. I guess the big feature movie producers have had some technology for a few years where they've been able to do what you talk about with the movies. But deepfakes is essentially a video, picture, and audio equivalent of what Photoshop was back in the late 80s, where we essentially get an image, or for a deepfake, it's a video clip, and the computer looks at it and then is able to do some fairly high-level photoshopping, not to borrow a trademark term, but in this case, we're actually photoshopping, if you like, the image of somebody else, or the voice of somebody else, including the mannerisms, the hand signals, the tilting of the head, the moving of the arms, essentially so that an actor who looks nothing like the intended target, some person of a different ethnic background could stand up, pretend to be me, and then the computer could make it look like me and sound like me. And this deepfakes specifically is referring to the ability to do this even at the layperson level. So you can pay, a few $100s or maybe even less now, spend a weekend and end up with the result that isn't too bad. And if you're a serious deepfaker, you can actually fool the professionals. So it's a pretty powerful doctoring of video footage, I guess.
Yeah, interesting that you mentioned that, because there was this craze, I think it was like last year or the year before, where there was this app called Face Swap, which is like you can swap your face with a photo of someone else. And that's pretty low level stuff that you can just do on your phone. And, to be honest, again, you're not going to really fool anyone probably into thinking that you are actually someone else. But the crazy part is that realistic deepfakes have really taken off. Now, like one of my first experiences with one of those was Star Wars creator George Lucas. Again, there seems to be a theme with Star Wars and deepfakes, but some guy on YouTube pretended to be George Lucas and he deepfaked George Lucas's face onto his own. And it was kind of realistic. Like it was like, oh, you have to kind of do a double take, but then you see it and you're like, okay, it's just a fake video. But then more recently, and this is where the scary part comes in, because I literally just showed this video to my fiance. There's a TikTok account where there's a guy who superimposes Tom Cruise's face onto his own. And that video is like a splitting image. You can't tell.
I've seen that. And I think, I don't know if it's the same video or a different one similar to it, but they actually had a roundtable interview discussion with George Lucas and Tom Cruise and a few other fairly well-known public figures, and they're all discussing something, but none of them are actually real people.
Yeah. And that's well, I mean, first of all, it's pretty cool. I read an article that, like you said, it's not something you can whip up in like, just a quick app swap of faces. Like it does require a bit of effort. And the guy who was doing the Tom Cruise thing said that, like, guys, there is a bit of effort that goes into this. You kind of have to do a bit of acting to get the mannerisms right and stuff. But the face swapping technology it just really gets it. Like the lighting and everything, it's really hard to distinguish. Now, it's cool to see the way technology is advancing, but are there any sort of issues with the fact that technology is heading this way?
Yeah. And I guess, depending on what our listeners may have heard, it seems like initially it's a bit of a laugh and you can have a bit of a joke with your mates or a bit of a fun time. But on a serious note, I guess the opportunities for good and or evil are limited only by our imagination now. If somebody wants to, take some money off somebody else, imagine getting a phone call from a loved person, a loved one, or a friend, or fiance or spouse or something, sounding like they're in distress. Hey, I'm stuck. My credit card's been stolen. Can you please just help me out here? Buy some, petrol or whatever else. And it would sound convincing. It'd be the right voice. It'd be all the right mannerisms. It'd be hard pressed for us to figure out who to trust. Or, on the political side, there's been a couple of deepfakes of some fairly well-known political figures. Barack Obama, of course, is no longer the US president, and nor is Trump, but both of those have been deepfaked. Trump was faked while he was in office. So imagine now that we have, I guess, Scott Morrison here in Australia, or for, in the States, Joe Biden or Kamala Harris, or, pick any political figure. Imagine if somebody decided to put words in their mouth, and imagine if those were inflammatory words that might cause difficulty. It's in the 60s and 70s, we worried about a Cold War with people firing missiles, but only two people could push a button, the US president or the Russian president. But now anybody could make a video, and it would, I guess, be the equivalent of someone saying, "We declare war on you," even if it's deepfake.
Yeah. And, the crazy thing, and this really hit home today, as I found out that one of the pieces of software that we actually use to edit this podcast, so pretty much what you can do is you grab a piece of audio, you chuck it in there, and it transcribes very accurately everything that you have said, right? And then what you can do is not only can you cut out bits that it recognizes, like your ums and your ahs, but also you can write in words, and it analyzes your inflections and stuff throughout the podcast or the audio recording. Now, just by the way, this is not the case with this podcast. This is actually me talking. But you can change the words and put words that you never said into there. Now, imagine doing that for somebody else and then putting, compromising words into their mouth, putting it out into public, and someone's reputation being tattered by that. You know what I mean?
Exactly. I just saw it even this morning. I think it was the last 2 or 3 weeks on a major TV syndicate in the United States. And the people, as they begin to realize exactly what's going on and what can happen here, it's causing genuine concern, I think. And I think for good reason. And several different interviews I've watched, people ask, well, what can we believe? How do we know anything's true anymore?
Because it's not only just about let's say a deep fake where there's a video, like a lewd video, and someone deep fakes a person's face onto that video to compromise that person. That is certainly harmful to that person's reputation. But on the flip side, it then calls every video into question, because it could be used as a defense in court when there's a video showing someone in a compromising situation, and the defense can say, well, how can you really trust that? That might be a deep faked video, right?
Yeah, and I guess I'm not quite sure what our listeners would be considering, but there was a day and age, 150 years ago, where maybe even close to 100 years ago, where photographic evidence was considered almost irrefutable in the court of law. Obviously, there was a legal process to follow, but a photograph was powerful, admissible evidence. And more recently, I suppose, video footage. In the 90s, when we had these war crimes, it was video footage that was used to help convict people like Slobodan Milosevic, for example. These days, if the same crimes were to be committed with deepfake technology, I can just imagine the defendant saying, "I didn't do that."
It raises a whole bunch of ethical issues. And one thing that you really pick up on in your article, Nathan, is that deepfakes are an issue because of one key word, and that is deception. Now, Nathan, I just want to ask you, do you think that in this day and age, we are being deceived a lot? Are we being deceived by the media around us? What's the level of deception that's happening around us, do you think?
Well, that's a good question, and it's probably a bit of a tricky one to answer, because it almost sounds like a conspiracy theory if we go around telling everybody that everything's a trick.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I guess the way I answer that question thoughtfully is to look back at what's happened in the last, few thousand years. I have a bit of an interest in the ancient Near East, and obviously technology changes and the sophistication might look different, but the idea of tricking people is very much old news. Look back at the Greeks using a horse to get into the city of Troy, possibly, if we believe that particular historian's narrative. Or we have, various examples of people using stratagem or deception to try and gain a political advantage or a military advantage. A particular book that I've found very interesting is a Chinese, I think he was a warlord or a general, called Sun Tzu, who wrote a book which is quite famous entitled The Art of War. And he essentially, to condense 13 chapters into one sentence, he says, war is the way of deception. And he goes into all kinds of examples and details. This, by the way, is a required reading for people who are in high level intelligence, the FBI, the US military leaders, they consider this book as like the ultimate textbook
Oh,
for
true.
conducting their operations. So clearly that's important. I can't probably share too much, but when I was in the United States, I actually played a key role in the visitation of an active US president in the location where I was at the time. I can say that deception was a key element in protecting the privacy of the president. There was very little was told that was actually true because the president's interests had to be protected. And
Oh,
so
wow.
I think there's possibly more deception going on than we realize. The tricky part is how much and what can we believe? And I don't know if I've got a good answer to that, but I'd encourage our listeners to have a think because it's going to be tricky, I'd imagine.
Yeah, that's right. And it really brings into the play this key idea, which is discernment, because one can then say that everything is, like you said, a conspiracy where everything is fake and nothing is true. And that sort of existence is very tricky, that sort of mindset, because then you're constantly in fear or feeling like everyone is sort of, it almost leads to a state of paranoia. But
That's it.
The interesting thing is that this idea of deception / deepfakes, it started off thousands of years ago. Now, it's really interesting because as Christians, we believe in the creation of the world. We also believe that there were certain events that led to sin entering the world. Can you just tell us about what that deception involved?
I guess from a Judeo-Christian perspective, the serpent, which was Satan, basically suggesting, I don't think God's giving you guys a fair deal. I reckon there's a better chance for you to have a happy life and to get more wisdom and knowledge and to have everything work out for you. Just do things my way. And in fact, here's a bit of an experiment for you. Here's some fruit to eat. And I reckon when you have this fruit, it'll open your eyes and make you really intelligent. And it happens to be that was the specific fruit that God had said, you can have any other fruit in the garden, but just not this one. And of course, those that read the story in Genesis chapter 3 carefully, you'll notice that as the serpent rehashes the words that God had said, he himself doesn't quite quote perfectly either. He kind of exaggerates and twists and inserts, just like a deepfake, I suppose, to make it sound like God said it, but it really wasn't God that said it. It was really the serpent that said it, and it just kind of sounded like God saying it, but twisted. And unfortunately for us, it looks like our parents fell for it. Now, there are other people who don't have a Judeo-Christian worldview, and that's fine because whether or not we subscribe to a Judeo-Christian worldview, this idea of deception is pervasive. Even in the Darwinian, naturalistic worldview, the whole reason we got here today is because the smart, tricky ones were able to deceive and usurp the dumb ones, and that's how we got here. So regardless of our worldview, we all agree that we got here by deception.
Wow, that's an interesting idea. Just sort of circling back a little bit about the deepfake, that the serpent was there, deceiving Adam and Eve. Now, Satan in his original form was a beautiful angel, right? So it wasn't it wasn't his original form, was it? He was tricking them by forming into this serpent, wasn't he?
That's our understanding, and I think there's good reason to hold that view. I certainly see it that way myself.
It's really interesting because then that sort of gives us the clue about how Satan operates in this world, which is, essentially using the art of deception. Now, while we can focus all our time discussing how Satan deceives people exactly, we also want to talk about what are the forces that are fighting against that, and what sort of tactics the other side is using. Now, what's God's playbook in this sort of situation?
So, borrowing from Sun Tzu, The Art of War, deception is the way of war. So if there is deception from Sun Tzu's perspective, there must be a war going on. There's no need for deception if everything's hunky-dory, if we're all just, living on a happy, peaceful existence with no problems going on. So I'd like to just suggest to our listeners, maybe you can think about this, but as you look at the writing of Sun Tzu and The Art of War, the mere fact that we have deception ought to be a clue that there is some kind of a tussle behind the scenes. Now, we can argue what that tussle is, but it's more than nothing. And I'd like to just put that in there as a precursor. And that's why I believe there is a battle between good and evil, because if there was no if there's only one side, like some people say there's the yin and the yang, it's all sort of together in one house, they're all, the good and the bad are basically one entity working together. If it was really that way, then deception wouldn't be required, would it? But because we do see deception, it's reasonable to suggest that there are, in fact, two parties at odds with each other. And I guess from my perspective, what I see, the ultimate antidote to deception is to bring out some evidence, to bring out some data points to trust. It's normal for us to be doubtful. It's normal for us to have questions. Hey, if there's deception going on, what can I trust? What can I believe? How can I know? And the way I see God playing into this equation is that God is willing to let us taste and see for ourselves, put the data on the table, so to speak, and say, look, you guys feel deceived, you are deceived. Let me show you some examples. Let me show you what I'm doing, and then you will know that I am God. And it just so happens there's one book in the Bible, the book of Ezekiel, which has been my PhD dissertation focus. This book, 72 times, almost half of those times specifically to a non-believing audience, not to Israel, but to people who don't believe in Israel's God. God says, I will do blah, 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 and then such and such will happen, and then so-and-so will follow after that, and then you will know that I am God. So essentially, in the book of Ezekiel, these 72 times, a whole bunch of those examples are specifically for the benefit of the person who doesn't know, who isn't sure, is God real? Can I trust? Can I be confident that I'm on the right track here? God says, let me give you some data points, and you decide. That to me is pretty reasonable.
Yeah, and the amount of prophecies in the Old Testament that also predicted that Jesus Christ would be born and then he'd also die for humanity, and then that ended up coming true.
Yeah, I don't want to take away thunder from other people or other episodes. I personally had an article in October 2020, and I was specifically looking at plane parking pilots and Paul the Octopus.
That's
and that
right.
was looking at the Isaiah scroll in this particular example. And that'd be interesting reading for our listeners if they're interested to see our rationale for how we got here.
Now, the interesting sort of key question that we can raise, we have been brought to being aware that there is this sort of spiritual battle going on, and it sort of feeds into these practical things that we see around us. I mean, one obvious way that I see it influencing the world around us is, the Bible does talk about the state of the world coming up to the time of when Jesus will return, and it sounded quite chaotic. You don't know who to trust, that sort of stuff. And then when I look at the world that we live in, it's progressively moving into a sort of a post-truth world. Now, this is a term that's been quite popular recently, and it means that truth is no longer an objective fact. And when truth is no longer an objective fact, then the question is, well, what do you trust? What can you trust, Nathan?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think that's a question that probably all of us would do well to think about. Because if we say we can't trust anything, that leaves us in a pretty hopeless place. And even just logically, philosophically speaking, it doesn't even make sense. Because if you say, I can trust nothing, it's almost like you're saying that you're going to trust that statement about trusting nothing. And how can you even trust that statement? It's sort of a self-refuting kind of a circle kind of an argument, that one. Then we could say, well, I'm going to trust myself. Or some of my colleagues say, well, I trust the good of humanity, which is a noble thing. And there are some good humans out there, but there are some pretty disgusting humans out there too. And even the good ones can surprise us at times, I'm sure all of us have had friends that we thought were decent people, or someone who was in a position of influence or power, even in the church examples, there's been people we thought we could trust who have done terrible things. So we can't trust people. We can't trust humanity in general. What or who can we trust? I guess for me, I get tremendous encouragement from turning to Jesus Christ. And that sounds kind of funny and flippant or even cliche-ish, but when I look at the life of Jesus, when I look at the way that he handled adversity, the way he handled people around him that were anxious and worried. Jesus used the expression, they're like sheep without a shepherd, which I think explains how people might feel today. It says that Jesus' heart went out in compassion for them, and he told them good news. He told the people that were discouraged they could have reason to have hope. He told those that were sad that he would help them find reason to be happy. He told those that felt like they were in prison or that they were pushed down and crushed that they could inherit the earth. These sort of promises, I think, are really worth having a good look at. And I take great courage for these. In Philippians, I think Paul here says, chapter 4, verse 6, be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. I think there's tremendous hope for us as we turn to something or someone or somebody bigger than what you and I can muster of our own puny human effort.
Yeah, that's right. And there's so many messages of encouragement in the Bible where Jesus says stuff like, I'm with you always, even until the very end of the age. That is very comforting in a sense when you think about how tricky and confusing the world around us is, that there is a constant that we can cling on to. Now, someone might be listening to this and find the idea of that quite intriguing on an intellectual level, but what's a sort of a first step that they can maybe take to experiencing that for themselves?
Well, I guess there could be two groups of people in our listening audience. Maybe there's a group that says, well, I don't even believe this stuff, that's kind of a bit far out there for me. And if you're in that first group, I would say, why not try a scientific experiment? Maybe you believe in the empirical method. Jesus, I believe, is real and exists. And if you were to go quietly, privately to him in the privacy of your own home with no one else around, and you are sincere, because God is able to see through our hearts, I believe. If we're just playing games, he will respectfully stand back. But if we, in the first category, say, God, I don't even know if you exist, this whole Jesus thing, I don't know about that. But I want to know, I want to have the assurance that you are real and that you care about me. And I'm open to whatever you want to do in my life. I want you to speak to me in a way that makes sense to me, and then I will know that I can trust you. I challenge you, if you don't believe, but you want to figure it out for yourself, I believe if you're sincere in your heart that Jesus will answer that request. And you can just make it audibly, you can make it private, you can even think it in your mind if you like, you can write it down on a piece of paper. But don't let any other human see it. Keep it private, because if another human sees it, you might think, somebody else just tried to play God on his behalf. No, keep it so private that it'll be impossible for any other human to interact. And then you'll know when it happens to your satisfaction that it's real. And for those of us that have had that experiment already conducted, or we have now the confidence that there's a Jesus out there, but not quite sure how to cash in, I would say it's really powerful to spend time talking to Jesus. It sounds really funny to begin with, but what I do is I will go for a walk somewhere in the morning where there isn't anybody else around, or where people aren't watching, or it's a bit of a private place, and I'll just ask the Lord to speak to me. I'll just say, Lord, I want to hear your voice today. I want to know what you're thinking. You know what I'm thinking already, so I don't need to tell you a whole lot, but I want to know what you care about. I'm worried about this, as you know. What's the peace that you can give me? How can I have confidence today? And I might read through the Gospel of Mark, for example. That's a good book for people who are new to faith. Or the book of John. And I find there's some powerful, powerful stuff in there that really will encourage us. Jesus faced some huge stuff, and we can be confident that as we face the big stuff, with Jesus' help, we can get through it too.
Yeah, that's a really powerful thought to finish up on, because at the end of the day, Jesus was walking around on this earth and Satan tried to deceive him as well. So we are not alone in this struggle in this day and age when it's tough to figure out what's true, what's not true, what's real, what's not real. So there's some really practical steps that you just shared with us there, Nathan, that I think are very great. So thanks so much for joining us this week, Nathan.
Thank you so much, and thank you, listeners.
Today's episode was based on an article appearing in this month's Signs of the Times magazine. A subscription is just $26 for 11 issues a year. To find out more, visit signsofthetimes.org.au in Australia or signsofthetimes.org.nz in New Zealand.
This is an Adventist Media podcast.